Hello, good evening and welcome to Beautiful Minds on Asase Radio 99.5 FM and on Facebook at Asase Radio 995. Last week on Beautiful Minds, our topic was how our family values change with time. My guest was Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofo. I learned many things from her, that values are basically what we hold dearly. Values are what motivates our actions and thoughts. She also said values are important to us because we experience internal conflict when our thoughts are in dissonance with our values. Values are used to prioritize what is important in our lives. Values possess intrinsic worth. Examples of values are love, truth, respect, and kindness. Ghana is a colonial creation, and some of the values we think are peculiar to us may have developed from the influence of and interaction with our colonizers. Nevertheless, Prof. Ampofo believes that certain values such as connectedness, humility, reciprocity, solidarity, charity, and truthfulness encapsulated in the popular term Ubuntu remain important to Ghanaians and to many African collectivist societies today. Some values are more tangible. For instance, respect for elders, not using the left hand and sharing. Ultimately, wealth is for the purposes of protecting one's family and lineage. This is like a race through our 1 hour conversation last week. But we also answered some important questions like how do our families shape our values? And Prof. Akos believes that it happens in several ways: through observations, when children learn from those around them, and intergenerational transmission, when parents offer lessons to children via stories, narrations, and interactions. Thirdly, our communities and neighbors also shape our values. And fourthly, governments pass into laws the values which they believe to be important to the safety and advantage of the society. For me, the most intriguing lesson was that the most important thing is the survival of the family, or Abusua as we call it in Akan. And so there is a flexibility of roles which our society allows people to play. So although an Abusuapaying is usually male, an economically successful female can be an Abusuapaying, as well as even a chief sometimes, if she would use her wealth for the survival of the Abusua. In some patrilineal societies, particularly, if a man were to die without a son to bear his name forward, a daughter is allowed to marry another woman and co-opt her wife's children into her family, giving them her father's name in order to keep the name or lineage alive. As to whether this is a sexual relationship or not, I'm not aware of. Gender roles, although rigidly held in many of our societies, are often shaped when it suits the survival of the lineage. This week, we will continue to segue into the difficult national conversation we are having about our family values. Our topic today is changing values and their impact on our behavior. Now, with us on Zoom, not in the studio, but on Zoom and on Beautiful Minds, is Prof. Akosua Adomako Ampofo once again. And she is joined by Prof. Osofo Asamoah Gyedu. Prof. Akos, welcome to the show a second time. Oh, a third time.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. My co-traveler, my sister professor. And it's a delight to see my brother professor.
Yes, and my Osofo professor.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Beautiful
Nice to see
Minds.
both of you. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yes. So, Asafo, please, last week, Professor Kos told us a bit about the work that she does, fascinating work. And I just wondered if you might tell us about a little bit about your work at the seminary, where you prepare pastors for a changing world.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to you, and good evening to all those who are listening to us on this program. Well, first and foremost, I'm a pastor before anything else, and pastoral ministry involves a number of responsibilities that have to do with human well-being, both in its this worldly understanding, and also ultimately for people to have security beyond this life. But so that's basically what I do. And as part of my ministry, so to speak, I have been called to teach in a seminary, which, as you have said, is a place where we train pastors, not just pastors, but we have quite a number of people here who are just Christian leaders who may not seek ordination, but who want to broaden their knowledge of scripture and the study of theology. So there are all sorts of people here. One of the people that I have just encountered on this campus is a very popular gospel musician in this country who is taking a Master of Divinity here just to expand her knowledge and so on. At this moment, I just happen to be the president of the seminary. So I oversee the work of colleagues who teach here and the staff. I still teach because that is my primary calling as far as being here is concerned. And of course, this is a university of some sort. So I also work as a scholar in African Christianity and teach courses in Pentecostalism and so on.
Oh, thank you. That sounds like a very busy and full schedule, Professor.
Very much so. Very much so.
Wonderful. So I'm just going to throw the questions in, and please, professors, just jump in at it. So do you both remember a time when our values have changed so drastically that our society has been really shaken up? And do you remember what caused the change and how we survived it, if we did?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Prof. Angie shared some of her thoughts, and I thought about this question. I didn't have much time to think about it, but I did think about it. And you know, at one level, I thought that this is something that repeatedly happens. We think that, you know, something has been shaken and our fundament is you know, is crumbling under us, and that it's probably new. And yet, at the same time, even though it's something that probably happens, you know, cyclically in history, there are moments when, at least for those of us alive at the time, we think that this is, you know, something has shifted. And for me, looking back, one such moment was during after the AFRC coup, you know, in 1978, when 79 or whenever it was, I'm getting this is why I'm not an historian. I was on KNUST campus as a freshman, and you know, we as students, yes, we felt that there was corruption in the system and people needed to be held accountable. And then suddenly I saw people who I thought I knew, and that we all valued the sanctity of life, and we felt we believed in due process, you know, shouting, "Let the blood flow," and that our fellow human beings should be killed, you know, on the mere say-so of, you know, people's accusations. I remember that you know, the markets, Kejetia Market, Edum, and so on, where a number of women, but not only women, but predominantly women, had stores, and my aunt was one of them. She used to sell cloth. Were being pulled into the streets by soldiers, being stripped and whipped because they were accused of hoarding, of messing up with the economy. They were accused of using their bottom power, essentially using their sex for their female gender. That's what I mean by sex, and also sexual intercourse with powerful men to access resources. And we seem to have no qualms, and we are a nation who traditionally, and in terms of family values, we do not look on our mother's nakedness, right? Of course, when you're at home, your mother is bathing, you may be in the bathroom. But it is a taboo for us, especially for men, to look on their mother's nakedness. And yet these women were being stripped, whipped, for, you know, just on the suspicion that all of them were corrupt. And let us even assume that they had committed the offenses for which they were being accused. We suddenly seem to think that it was okay to, you know, to treat them this way without due process. And we know that in our traditions, you go through long palavers to, you know, determine whether the crime that you are being accused of is legitimate or not. Around that same time too, we had this notion of we're not going to sit down, make the cheaters anymore. And it, you know, it looked like anybody could get up and decide that authority was not to be believed. Figures in authority were problematic, that wholesale people above a certain leadership level were to be condemned for actions and inactions that had led a country. And for me, it was a moment, and I saw a certain shift that, to be honest, I'm not sure that we have recovered from, because I see certain aspects of intolerance and certain aspects of an unwillingness to, you know, recognize each other as part of this larger ebusuya, brothers keepers, and so on. Whether it started then or it started before, and I only felt it then because I was a young adult, I don't know. But for me, it was a moment of shifting.
That's very deep. When I put that question together, to be honest, I didn't know what to expect, but you are absolutely right. That was a point of inflection in our country for us, our generation, as young people. Then you are absolutely right. Professor Osofo, how about you?
Well, given where Akosua started from, I want to believe that we must be around the same age. Because I would say that the very first government that I saw and paid attention to as a young adult would be Kutu Achampon's government that had just overthrown another government. And I remember that as school children, we had to celebrate something called 13th January Revolution. So that Achampon Revolution must have occurred on 13th January. But even long before then, in primary school, this must have been between class 1 and class 2. I recall my father collecting a number of books from his shelf. Most of the books related to Kwame Nkrumah, and he bent them.
Wow.
I don't remember the reason, but much later I learned that the popular Kwame Nkrumah had been overthrown, and anybody who kept any sort of memorabilia, books, whatever items associated with Nkrumah was being arrested or being harassed or being beaten or something like that. What the implications of that were for our values, I wouldn't know. But I realized that since then, we have embarked on this very long journey of trying to recover the Nkrumah heritage. And we haven't succeeded. Because as they say, you can't cut your nose to spite your face. And that is exactly what I think happened at the time. I was too young to be able to understand everything. But reading around the matters, issues later, that is the thing that conclusion that I came to. So as I said, the first government that I saw myself was the Kutu Achampong government. And I recall that in the early years of Achampong's government, everybody was praising the man, especially when he introduced the social intervention policy of a communitarian nature called Operation Feed Yourself. Every schoolboy or girl was taught that we needed to feed ourselves. Ghanaians had backyard gardens everywhere and so on. And if I remember correctly, food became one of the least expensive things that Ghanaians could lay hands on. I don't know what went wrong, but suddenly we started going down. And that downward spiral came with it a certain level of moral decay that sort of led to the situation that Akosua has just described. There is something that has never left me. A friend of mine who ran a chemical shop was accused of having sold a tube of penicillin above the control price. I lived in Takoradi, that's where I grew up. They brought him out to the street on Takoradi Market Circle, stripped him naked, and whipped his back until the flesh came up. Since then, anytime I saw anybody who had made his money under that regime, the June 4th regime, I got very upset because people had suffered. I mean, I saw the sort of things that Akosua has talked about, but I don't have the grace to talk about the things I saw done to women publicly. So I'm not going to go there. So I think that marked a very major and seismic shift in our values when authority was undermined completely. And anybody who had any sort of authority was a criminal. And people who had worked hard for their money, their resources were taken away, some fled the country and so on. It was just chaotic. And as I talk to you, I don't think anybody has apologized for that. And I think that's part of our problem.
Yes, I believe an attempt was made in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help people overcome the trauma of those days. The injustice of mob action and the robbing of hard-earned business capitals, like, Professor Akosua said, of the market women, and the trauma of, on some people, many people lost their lives. And this is interesting. It's interesting that you both raise it as points in a society where values shifted. And it's interesting because it's It's a time when we saw the outward expression of mob action on people that were, most people who were innocent of what they were accused of. And so I'd like us to hold on to those images, because we will come back to that when we talk about what's happening today in our responses to the LGBTQI challenge, because I think we're there again at a shift, and it's important that we talk about this shift. So, Prof. Akosua, in your opinion, how are we in Ghana coping with the challenge of alternative lifestyles?
Yeah, that's it's a difficult question. You know, coping with quote unquote what you call alternative, or coping with change is always difficult for human beings. You know, because we get settled into what we are comfortable with. We get settled with what we are familiar with, and you know, what we believe to be right. You know, we establish our values. Sometimes we get comfortable with things that are not necessarily our values if we really reflect. But it's, you know, it's become like the status quo, and it's easier to kind of live with it than to try and bring about change. So I'm sure you both agree with me that very often, you know, there are things that as Ghanaians we generally disagree with or frown upon. You know, bribery and corruption, whether it's getting a driver's license or a passport or whatever it is. And you know, someone will say, you know, I don't tolerate. I've been trying to I've been trying to change ownership of a car so I can sell it for the last 6 years, and I have refused to go and pay anybody. So my journey has been difficult, and people tell me that I'm being silly, but I intend to see it through, right? So we develop the attitude that Ghana is sanity. That this is the way Ghana is, or you know, you want to confront something, and people will ask you rather sarcastically and maybe judgingly that are you not a Ghanaian? It's like, do you just come from another planet? You think that you alone, you're coming to change something here. So yes, we disagree with something, but the thought of how to change it becomes exhausting. And so people are like, let me just live with the status quo. So generally coping with change, it's not easy. It's not easy to do. It's, you know, it's challenging. And I think that the older we become, the more set we are in our ways and what we are familiar with. And so change can be scary. And we, especially when it's things that we do not fully understand, right? And if we are very honest with ourselves, as we look back from one generation to another, we realize that once upon a time we were young. Often we were also quite rebellious as far as the older generation were concerned. And, you know, we seem to forget that. I remember many years ago, my brother, who's now in his 50s, was probably a young man in his 20s, and he came home with an earring in his ear. And my father lambasted him, you know. It's like, if he had a yes, sir, you know, we don't do that in this house. And, you know, where do you think you come from, and so on. And I asked my father, do you recollect the many narratives you have given us about, you know, your own life as a student in London, and when you came back, and you know, attire, and then bell bottoms came, and your father said that, you know, well brought up young men didn't dress like this, platform shoes was another issue. You know, so just think back on those times, and you know, maybe do not be as judgmental about this young man with an earring in his ear. And I said, Daddy, this earring in his ear, will it change who he is? You know, and my father was generally a very liberal person. You know, of my parents, if we wanted to do anything that was off the beaten curve, we went to my father and not to my mother. So I think it's, you know, coping with change generally is difficult. Coping with change when we think that there's a threat to an ordered system we believe in is even more difficult. And coping with change about things that we don't understand is also scary. So, this is why we do not cope well with new things, right? And I guess, the question is what do we do then? But you didn't ask me that yet. So I will end and say that it's difficult. It's difficult to cope with change. It's difficult to look at our children doing things, dressing in certain ways that we find disapproving, that we disapprove of. And we have fears for their well-being. Sometimes we have genuine fears. Sometimes we haven't even thought about it clearly. And if they challenge us with questions as to actually what specifically about this action or dressing or interest of mine, troubles you, we have problems articulating it because we've actually not logically thought through it. But sometimes we do have genuine concerns. There's a young woman dressed a certain way. We may have concerns that it will attract undue attention to her. She might be sexually harassed or abused. We may have that genuine fear. Other times it's our pride about how we will be vicariously judged, or we will be judged as good or bad parents because people will look at our children and say, "Hey, I saw Akosua's daughter. Did you see some short skirt that she was wearing?"
Right.
And then I become the bad parent. So
so we have difficulty with change, and sometimes it's born out of fear for what will happen if we allowed change to come in. So I know, Prof, would you like to just add a little bit or take away a little bit from Prof. Akosua on this one, and then I have another question for you.
Well, yes, I'm not sure whether I'll have the courage to take anything away from what Akosua has. Well, I think that as she has very eloquently explained, we all have to manage a certain tension between tradition and change. Mm-hmm. Let me put this within the religious context. Mm-hmm. In the church in which I grew up, incidentally, I had to preach that at a funeral on Friday. The church in which I grew up in Takoradi, among other things, as a youth leader, I also served as an usher. In those days, as ushers, we were under firm instructions to send home any woman who came to church in trousers. Oh boy. And I'm not that old, so I'm talking about late 1970s, early 80s.
That's old.
Oh, that's a young man.
Yes, with a lot of hair, and I used to wear a beard as well. We were under firm instructions to.
And these days, beards are not allowed because it means that you are a rebel.
I see. So, and as I sit here, I still regret the fact that we sent young girls away from church who had been dressed by their mothers. And we all behaved like Pharisees. The other set of people we're supposed to send home were women who came to church without headgear. And we did that religiously.
You realize that in both cases you were targeting the female sex.
Well, I was working on the instruction.
of another male, no doubt.
Still, but today, one of the churches that used to hold tenaciously to that teaching, the Church of Pentecost, has relaxed that rule. Something that we all thought the Bible described. Suddenly, it's not applicable anymore. But can you imagine the damage that we have done to people I can't begin to think of the many people who came to church, who were turned away, and who probably did not come back because of the humiliation associated with being turned away from church because you were in trousers or you were not in a good headgear.
So
In other words,
can I hold your thought? I just want to interject with one small example and then back to you. Recently,
go ahead.
a young man who's in my circle of, I have a lot of children, and he's in my circle of children. He studied abroad in the US, to be precise, and he attends one of our so-called mega churches in the US. And he told me recently that he had been asked to step down from being in the praise and worship team, I think it was, because he has braided his hair. He has braided his hair. He's not allowed to serve on the praise and worship team anymore.
Wow.
Then asked them, and then he asked why, and they said a man shouldn't have long hair. Then he pointed out two white boys in the praise and worship team who had their hair below their shoulders. So he said, but they too, their hair is long. Are they not also men? And then they gave him, some excuse about, white hair and what it does. So I just wanted to throw that in. And, this is a young man whose faith is very deep. We've had many conversations. In fact, he's planning on going to do an MA in divinity. But he has such deep questions and pain about the church. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. I'm not surprised because only recently I had to call a senior colleague. In the Methodist and Presbyterian churches, we have an Anglican church, we have something called confirmation. When a young person gets to adolescence and wants to declare his or her faith in Christ, we go through a process of confirmation. And this senior minister refused to confirm a young man because he had Rasta hair. And I called him and asked him what this has to do with faith in the first place. So sometimes, especially those of us who preach, we talk about the Pharisees all the time. We don't also realize that the way we behave is even more Pharisaic than the Pharisees. Of course, the Pharisees were being religiously correct, if you like, and protecting religious values without paying attention to the fact that they were undermining people's rights and going. That's why Jesus Christ was very mad at them. Because they were more interested in outward forms of religious expression than inward grace and so on.
Right.
And so I think the way we have sometimes, especially speaking from a religious point of view, we have interpreted scripture and sought to apply it. And for a country like Ghana, a continent like Africa, where religion is part of everything we do, one cannot resist talking about values without the use of religion. And religion can be used in negative ways. And that's what we must all understand. And it's a good thing to have faith, but if we don't take care in the application of faith, we may end up harming our own values.
Right. So, that brings me to the next question then. What are the pressures that the church faces today from the LGBTQI++ community? How is the church challenged? In what ways are churches challenged?
Is that directed at me or directed at the
Yes,
professor?
indeed. It's sort of, it's
You first.
It's become
continuing your,
it's become one of the most difficult and sensitive issues of our time. But let me begin by saying that we should all appreciate the fact that we are human before we are religious. If I may speak as a Christian, the Bible does not say that in the beginning God created say a Methodist or an Anglican or a Muslim or a Buddhist. It says, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And then when it came to the human being, he says he created us in his own image. So God, to begin with, did not approach the human person from an ethnic or sexual or whatever point of view. We must approach each other through our common humanity. In fact, that is one of the central values of African cultures, to recognize our common humanity. And that also means that we must recognize life as sacred. We may have disagreements over lifestyle choices and so on, but that doesn't make anybody more human than another. Speaking as a Christian and as a Christian pastor, the church has a very strong and clear position on matters of sexuality and gender. As a Christian denomination, the denomination to which I belong, and as a seminary, what we teach is that God created male and female. And we recognize that the proper place for, if you like, reproductive action is in a properly conducted marriage. So the things that we speak and counsel against include inappropriate use of one's sexuality, whether in adultery or fornication or same-sex and so on. However, I should be careful not to make myself the custodian of morality. In other words, the fact that somebody has made a different choice does not, I don't have the right to demonize anybody. And so what we have said from the context to which I belong is that we preach what we think is the biblically correct mode of sex and sexuality, modes of sex and sexuality, but then we do not demonize the different other. And so I do not endorse any kind of action that demeans another human being. I may not like the lifestyle because I have made my choices based on my faith, but I think I must also respect other people's humanity and not demonize them. My presiding bishop will say, we love the sinner, but we hate the sin. And I think that's the position that God stands. As to who determines what is correct sexuality and so on, that one we have made our position clear, and we need to be careful how we treat the different other.
Right. So the church is walking a really tight rope.
It is really tight.
Yeah, it's really tight. Prof. Akos, there's pressure for us to think alike and share the same values normally. In every culture, every society, it's easier for us if we, I don't want to say toe the same line, but if we share the same values, we obey the same rules and so on. What makes us fear to be different or to, to disagree?
This disagreement is associated with conflict, and conflict is painful. Life is easier if we all are just on the same page. Let me give maybe not a ridiculous example, but perhaps it kind of explains things. It's also hard work when you are dealing with a lot of diversity. So I have 2 children. They have taken different paths. They have different strengths. Now, my younger daughter, and we can now see, we saw this strength when she was young. She's very creative, very imaginative. She's a very good writer. And she used to write these amazing essays, we thought. And she won a few prizes for, both local and international along the way. But she could not spell. We did not think that this was a big deal. In any case, by the time she came along, there were computers. So, we knew that as she grew further in life, she'd be able to use spell check and so on. The teachers in her school were very, primary school JSS, it was, especially in primary school, her inability to spell properly was a problem. And these unique creative essays were also a problem. Now, if you've got 50 children in a class, you've told them how to write an essay, let's say, write an essay about my father.
You have a form, introduction, middle, and end.
Introduction. My father is a doctor. His favorite food is yam and palm nut soup. He loves watching sports and blah, blah, blah. And my mother, he's dark in complexion, literally that way, and so on. If you come and you start an essay about my father with, when I wake up in the morning, I sometimes smell the pleasant fumes of pancake from the kitchen, and then I know that my father is awake and he's thinking of us. You have sent your essay in a completely different direction. Now, the teacher who has these points that she's looking for, check, so she can mark these 51 essays, has to have a whole new marking scheme just for you. Now, if she's got 50 kids and 12 of them are going to go off on this tangent, it's a lot of work for her. When will she finish marking those 50 scripts, get on to something else and prepare for the next day? So diversity adds to our workload. It can also be challenging because now you've taught the children that daddy pays school fees and mommy does the cooking. That's what you've taught them. It's in the textbook. Now this child has seen that in her home, that's not the case. And she comes and flips it. You've got to think, hey, it's true. I know that this is true in many households, but this is in the textbook. This is what I've taught. Now, what am I supposed to do with this child? Do I give her the marks or don't I? Diversity is on that level. But we have to recognize, as my colleague professor has said, that we have to appreciate everybody's humanity. People are different. We may not appreciate because, a lifestyle or a choice, or people even claiming that they were born that way, particularly about things we have not ourselves researched or understood. So, how am I supposed to deal with this? Now, I'm confronted with something that goes against what I have believed all my life, and people are telling me to, that this is, a new way of thinking of things. And, there have been in many of the Christian spaces that I'm in, and I'm also speaking now as a Christian, we've had debates, especially recently, about as there has been abuse of people in the queer community. We have seen videos of people being stripped on the mere suspicion. We've heard stories of people being killed. And we've had conversations, and I have asked questions.
And you're talking about people who are accused of being homosexual.
Accused of being lesbians, accused of being trans, because women are supposed to look a certain way, and this woman looks too masculine, that man looks too feminine, so they must have done something. And we're having conversations, and then, maybe somebody will ask a question. Well, okay, we are dealing with this sin. How about these other sins in Leviticus? They say we shouldn't mix two garments, of different fabrics. We shouldn't, if people are found in adultery, they should be stoned. We're not following all these laws in Leviticus. Then people get upset that these questions are being raised. And my perspective is that the God that I serve is omniscient. This God knows all things. And this God is has all the power. This God cannot be reduced by any foolish question that I might ask. This God cannot be removed from his throne because I have dared to pose a question that other people are uncomfortable with. God can manage our fears, I believe. God can manage our doubts. God is not changed by, my inadequacy, my lack of knowledge, my standards that may be incorrect, my genuine questions. And I think that, I know I'm deviating a bit from your question, but I think that many of our young people lose their faith when they go into intellectually more challenging spaces, because we, in grounding them in their faith, we do not allow them to ask questions. The minute they asked a question like, who created God? Akwalabone, how dare you ask such a question? I think that as parents, as leaders, it is okay to hear questions and to say, I don't have the answer to that one. I do not know. Where you feel that you are theologically sound enough to proffer an answer, you do so. Where a question is asked that you do not have an answer, you say, this is the knowledge of God that I have at the moment. This is what I believe. This is what I'm working with. You have asked me a question that I have not thought about, and I don't know. Let's research it. Let's engage in a discussion. Let's see what different people think. I have reached out to theologians on issues because I feel that they should know. And we are not willing to have those conversations. We are not willing to listen. I have learned a lot more this week, on intersex, on the fact that, our sex is indeterminate before 7 weeks of gestation. So there are things that happen, in the womb that allow us to become, quote unquote, and I'm sure I'm not even using the medically correct language, that allow us to become male or female. Something can go off course there. I do not have the professional capacity to understand this, but I'm asking questions. And I think that, we should ask questions. We shouldn't deliberately ask ridiculous questions. But if we have genuine questions, we should ask them. We should entertain them. We should butt heads around them. We should do our research also. We should allow people with professional competencies to educate us, and two doctors will not necessarily have the same opinion. And I think that all that we've seen with COVID and fake news has shown us that we should read. Ghanaians do not like to read. Even this bill that we are talking about, there have been so many.
So that brings me to that question. So I want to direct that question to Osofo Professor. Osofo Professor, Prof has brought us to the point of this bill in Parliament, which is awaiting debate. And this bill purportedly is one that espouses family values. But many people have said that this is an anti-gay and an anti-lesbian, anti-LGBTQI bill. What do you think about it? Because it's supposedly there to promote family values. And then I want to come back to Prof. Akosua. She's very passionate about this matter.
Well, it depends on what we define as family values. Family values cannot be restricted to sexuality. I mean, I think family values involve a very broad and wide range of things, some of which we have gotten correct, some of others we have gotten wrong. For example, example has been given in having been brought up to think that it's fathers who give money for women to cook and so on and so forth. I mean, there are things that we all grew up with that now we've had to re-educate ourselves on how they happen and so on and so forth. I have read the bill. As I say, I can only speak from a perspective of faith because I belong to a church tradition that teaches male and female. And so most parts of the bill, especially areas where the bill seeks to promote what they call a proper human sexuality and so on, that is consistent to with what we believe and teach. Where I have reservations is the criminalization of behavior that we perhaps don't fully understand. I'll give you an example, a very quick example. Very recently, a gentleman brought a complaint to me about his son, that the son was behaving very strangely at home. Keeps to himself, is always behind closed doors, on his computer, and he doesn't think that he's studying, standards in school have fallen, and so on. So, and he didn't understand. He initially, when he came, he thought that he was bringing the son for prayer. But of course, there is a way in which we have a program here called pastoral care and counseling. So I had to do the pastoral care side of things. I engaged with a young man, and the first question he asked me was whether people are born gay. And I said, I don't know. And that's the truth. I don't know. And he said to me, the reason why he behaves that way is that he has orientation towards other boys. Of course, I had to work on him. I didn't have the courage to tell his father, but I had to deal with the situation. And he is still in touch. He comes to ask questions. We pray about the situation and so on and so forth. I can't say everything that I have said to him on radio, but what it told me was that people are picking up things even through the media. And we must not underestimate the fact that the media has a huge influence on everything that young people do today. And that is something that we must pay attention to. So the point I'm making is that I have read the bill. I will hesitate in going on the path of actually being violent towards another human being because I disagree with their lifestyle. I will preach against it, but I'll be careful in treating the person the way the religious authorities try to treat the woman caught in adultery, because the first point of pastoral care is something we call empathy, to try and put yourself in somebody else's situation. If people need help, you don't destroy them before you help them. That's what I would say. And so I am usually put off when I go to church and people are calling the fire of God upon their enemies. And I tell my students that God is not in the business of killing people and destroying them. The first thing God wants us to do is to love people and have them change, not to kill them. So God doesn't listen to prayers of calling that, because if God was in the business of burning sinners, I won't be here, because I'm also a sinner anyway, saved by grace. So I'll be careful in promoting any kind of behavior that promotes violence against other people.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because it just kind of takes me back to the beginning of this show, where you both recognized the switch or point of inflection in time, where people took the law into their own hands, were not neighborly, were not collective in thinking, and were just out to destroy other people on hearsay. And now we go back, and now we see people being stripped, being embarrassed, being shamed, being chased, being almost beaten to death, and so on, just on the suspicion of being a gay, lesbian, LGBTQI, being different in their sexuality. And Ampofo, I really like it.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I like it.
Very quickly throw in. Are you with me?
Yes, please continue.
I was going to quickly throw in something that happened very frequently when we were children. There were children who used to wet their mats. We didn't used to sleep on bed in those days, mat. And in the morning in our community, they will wrap the mat around you and shame you publicly. We all joined with empty margarine cans and tin cans playing up. I mean, can you imagine the psychological damage that we have done to our friends because of that kind of behavior?
Yeah, I can imagine. And so I think that we're at this point where we know at our age that this kind of public castigation is not going to do it for us. It's not going to change the attitudes or the sexual orientation of people. And we need to really sit down think about it and ask ourselves whether it was right that we sent girls home for wearing trousers when today, look at where we are sitting. Women wear trousers to work and so forth and so on. So values change over time. And so is it right that at this point in time, we inflict so much harm and danger on our fellows who are different from us? And we only have 2 minutes to go. So I'm just sort of going to leave this topic here for a minute and ask, and I hope we'll come back and finish this conversation. How can the church do better?
Let Akosua do
Okay.
that.
Osofo has spoken, so let me also say something. I think that we don't, people who identify as queer, whether they are lesbian, whether they are homosexuals, whether they are trans, whether
We have just a minute, Prof. We have a minute.
Judging people is a very poor evangelism strategy. Hating people is a very poor evangelism strategy. If we look at Jesus' strategy, I'm speaking now as a Christian, he drew people to him, and then as a result, lifestyles change. So if as Christians we believe that Jesus is the way, then what we have been asked to do is to introduce people to Christ. What Christ will do in those people's lives is the Holy Spirit's work to do. But we want them to change, and then we will invite them into the church. In that way, nobody's going to be in the church because we all came with sins. And I have a serious problem with our cherry picking of sins. If we want to criminalize deviant sexual activity, as a woman who has seen a lot of other women suffer from domestic violence, maybe we should start with adultery. And if we put all the adulterers in jail, perhaps our jails will be so full that we'll have other things to think about. So basically, I'm being facetious here, or a bit ridiculous. Criminalizing, as Kwabna has said, criminalizing our behavior is not the way to go. And Angie, you have said so also. That is not the way to change people. If we genuinely believe that a certain choice is a sin and we want to love the sinner, I don't think that beating them over the head, beating them physically, and then sending them to jail, and probably after I've sent them to jail, I'll go there with the Bible and say, well, actually, you know what? I really love you, and I want you to change the way that you live. And here I am, I'm coming to introduce you to Christ. Who the hell, excuse me to use that word, and I'm doing this deliberately, is going to listen to that message? So let's be very careful that we don't legislate sin, especially sin that people commit in private. And there's a reason why there are a lot of sexual things that we do not talk about as a people. And I learned this as a child, that sexual activity is a taboo to talk about it until there's an issue that you bring before the family. A woman could say she's not getting enough sex from her husband and so on. But otherwise, it was like it was none of our business. So we lived and let live. And we tolerated even deviant aspects that we didn't understand or didn't approve of. We said that that's we are not going to watch and see what's going on. So as a Christian, I want us to approach this with compassion. As a Ghanaian, I want to remind us that even if the data tell us a majority of Ghanaians are Christian, this nation doesn't belong to only Christians. We have a constitution that is for everybody, and people are allowed to not agree with our perspective. And I think that we should, as humans, as we've repeatedly said in this program, respect people's right to do that, so long as it is not harming us. If we want to deal with public actions, there are existing laws, and we can come up with new laws about, public behavior, same-sex marriage, if we want to do that, because marriage is a state institution. It's not a private.
Very well. Very well. Thank you, Prof. Now, Prof, I can't, Prof Osofo, Prof Kwabna, I can't let you go without half a minute of your conclusion. We're already 2 minutes for time, but I think Asase will understand.
Well, I think that I will conclude with the critical element of that Jesus taught us to demonstrate in terms of value, which is to love. And so everything we are doing, we have to ask ourselves, does this reflect the image of God in us? Thank you.
Thank you.